ICFWP live stream. It's great to have you on board. It's great to connect with so many people, and it's nice to read through the chat and see you all communicating with one another. I want to wish you a very happy Sabbath, and I hope your week has been well. Wrapped up in the story of creation is an unseen truth that is only revealed, only understood when we look at the Hebrew language. And that truth has something to do with how you and I see ourselves. There's a fascinating scenario in the creation story. You see, after God creates the cosmos and brings order out of chaos, pulls order from potential, and orders everything, puts everything in its rightful place, and creates the habitable world, the habitable universe, he does something fascinating. He says, "Hey Adam, come over here. I want you to join in the creative process." And the way you're going to join in the creative process is that you're going to start to name the animals, name the creatures that I have created. It's a fascinating scenario. God literally invites Adam into the creative purpose. Because from the Hebrew perspective, to name something is to bring meaning into the universe. From the Hebrew perspective, a name represents something about a human or a creature's role or capacity. In order for Adam to name the creatures, Adam has to learn or identify some function or role of that creature. He has to look at that animal, see its purpose, its function, what it does on earth, and then he names it. And in naming it, he creates and brings meaning into the universe. It is a powerful situation. It's a powerful act that God invites Adam into. But I wondered if I asked you the question, which creature does Adam name last? I wonder what you would say to that. Now, some of you might say, well, actually, there is no order given in Scripture of what Adam names, which creatures he names first and which creature he names last, and you would be partly right. But maybe the more astute among you will say, actually, no, there is one creature brought before his eyes that he does name last, and that's Eve. And if you said that, you would be half right. You're right, half right, that is. He does name Eve after he names the animals. But more than that, after naming Eve, he also names himself. In fact, it is himself he names last in the created or the creation narrative. You see, he identifies himself, his purpose and his role and his function in the world when he encounters Eve. The Hebrew word for Adam, or rather man, used up until the encounter he has with Eve, where he says, "This is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she came from man." The use of the word man in the Hebrew sense up until that point in the Hebrew is Adam. Adam, the Hebrew word Adam. All through Genesis chapter 1 and even through Genesis chapter 2, until we get to the point where he names Eve and then names himself using the word man, there is a different Hebrew word used for man in that instance, the first time it is used in the creation narrative. Let's read Genesis chapter 2 and verse 23. "And Adam said," now the word Adam there in Hebrew is Adam. It's the same use of the word for man and Adam up until that point. Adam is used both for Adam and man in Genesis 1 and in Genesis 2 up until that point. Then it says this, "This is now bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman," or in the Hebrew, Isha, "because she came out of man." And Adam is not used in this situation. The word used is Ish. The first use of the Hebrew word Ish is in this situation, this scenario. It is fascinating when God asks Adam to name the animals, he sees after naming the animals that he is alone, that actually he doesn't have an equal or a suitable. And when he is encountered, or when he sees Eve, when he looks at her, he's able to name her Isha, and through naming her, he is able to name himself. It's a fascinating situation, a fascinating scenario, that Adam has a true understanding, or gains a true understanding about his role and about his purpose only through the eyes of seeing himself through the woman. He looks at the woman, he encounters her, and he finally gets who he is. His purpose is brought into reality, and he's able to name himself, because in the Hebrew sense, naming yourself is about bringing your purpose and function into reality. And it's the first time Ish is used. He names himself last because finally, when he's confronted with Eve, when he looks at himself through the eyes of Eve, he's able to see his role and his function and his responsibility. He understands something about who he is. He's brought into orientation only when he sees himself through another human being. Seeing her means seeing him. But it reveals a very human truth that is pertinent and relevant to all of us, and particularly those in God's church. We only truly see ourselves. We only truly see ourselves. We only understand our true purpose and our life in relationship to other people. We only get a more real understanding of who we are, of our role, of our function, when we are brought into relationship and community with other people. It was true of Adam, and it is also true of us in a broader communal sense. But just like Adam, he couldn't truly understand his true nature and identity because he was in isolation. He did not have Eve until Eve was put in front of him, and he encountered Eve, and then he saw something about his purpose and his function. He was, if you like, brought into reality through the relationship in community with other human beings. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen the film Avatar. It was a very famous film that came out. It was, at the time, cutting edge in its graphics. And it tells the story of humans that want to enter this kind of, unseen world where there's these blue creatures. They're rather large, and, they're avatars. And human beings only can enter into that world when they're hooked up to a machine, and then they embody the blue creatures themselves. So they have a lifeless blue creature, they're hooked up to a machine, and they're actually transported into that body. And the main character, two of them, one of them's a human, and one of them's actually the avatar in this world, this kind of alien-like world. And so the human gets hooked up to the machine and is able to enter into the psyche of the avatar and enter into this avatar community. And as he enters into the community, of course, not knowing much about the community and about the world around him, he starts to see the community for what it is. And he meets the community, he starts to live his life amongst the community, and he truly is part of that community. And there's this well-known scene, which actually is the theme of one of the songs in the Avatar film, is when he is dying as a human being, and the woman that he fell in love with and he built a relationship with, she comes and sees him in his human form and saves him. And he wakes up, he looks at her and she looks at him, and they both say, "I see you, I see you." It is the title of one of the leading songs of that film. But I think this concept helps us understand, in one sense, what God is doing with us and what he is doing, his ultimate plan. Because Jesus does exactly the same. To help see us, to help understand us, and for us to understand him, he gives up divinity and he comes in the flesh and comes and enters the community of humans. He enters the human family, gives up the divine family and enters the human family. And becoming human, he sees through our eyes what we go through, and in the reverse, we see ourselves through him. And as part of becoming as he becomes part of the human community, as he becomes flesh, it does not have a neutral effect. It has an effect where he's able to fully realize his purpose and role as the Son of God in human form, in human flesh. It's only when he's part of the community of human beings that he's able to fulfill his purpose. Let's read Hebrews chapter 2, verses 10 to 11 and 17 to 18. Notice what the effect of becoming part of the community is as he becomes flesh. For it was fitting for him, that is Jesus, for whom all things and by whom are all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through suffering. It is only in being made human, suffering, being part of the human family, the human community, that he's able to experience suffering and therefore bring many sons to glory to help and aid you and I. The verse continues, for both he who sanctifies and those who are being sanctified are all of one, for which reason he also is not ashamed to call them brethren. He sees himself, his function, his purpose. He's able to fulfill that function and purpose when he becomes part of the community, when he sees you and I. And it continues in verse 70. Therefore, in all things he had to be made like his brethren. He had to be made like us. He had to see us for what we were. He had to become like us, that he might to be a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For in that himself has suffered, being tempted, the purpose of being tempted and suffering, he is able to aid those who are tempted. He's able to help you and I because he sees us for who we are. He's become part of the community and he's able to fulfill his function and his purpose to a greater degree. That is the purpose of being brought into relationship with one another. We see ourselves in a more accurate degree, an accurate sense. We are able to fulfill our function and understand our purpose through relationship. You see, there's a South African saying. It comes from the Zulu word hello. It's soabona, or sorobona. And this word in Zulu for hello has a fascinating meaning. It literally means, or literally translates, I see you, and by seeing you, I bring you into being. I see you, and by seeing you, I bring you into being. We find our place. We find our being. We actually help manifest the purpose and the function that we were created for in relationship when we see one another being part of the community. This is at the heart of one of Paul's teachings about the church, about the community of believers. He says in 1 Corinthians 12, for in fact the body is not one member but many. The discrete unit of humanity is not the individual. As we read in Genesis, is actually the family. That is the lowest or the smallest unit of a civilization is the family. It's not the individual. And Paul picks up on a theme here. He says you might be many individuals, but you are one body. And that's how he sees us. If the foot should say, because I am not a hand, I am not of the body, is it therefore not of the body? And if the ear should say, because I am not an ear, I am not of the body, is it therefore not of the body? You can't separate, you can't dislocate the body and it function properly. If you're an eye, you can't hear with the eye, you have to have the ear to hear. And the ear has to have the eye to see. You can't dislocate yourself. Because if you dislocate yourself from relationship and community, you diminish your capacity to function in your role and your purpose. It is only when we see each other, it's only when we put in relationship and community with one another, is our true understanding of ourselves manifest. That is our identity, our role, and our purpose. It can only be activated through seeing one another and being in community and relationship with one another. It continues, verse 17, if the whole body were an eye, where would it be? Where would be the hearing? If the whole were hearing, where would be the smelling? Verse 18, but now God has set the members, each one of them, in the body just as he pleased. And if they were all one member, where would the body be? If you were all just one member, just individuals, fragmented, where would the body be? You cannot dislocate yourself from the community and function in the purpose God created you and I for. God says that you have a purpose, you have a function in the church. And just like Adam, when he encountered Eve, he saw himself for what he was. He saw his role and his purpose. He was able to name himself, which is, from the Hebrew perspective, a way of bringing purpose and meaning into this universe. Being able to understand your role and function. And God says, you understand your role and function through the relationships you have with the body of believers, the church. Without that, how can you be a body? How can you be a body? This is one of the challenges to the Western philosophy of the individual. So often in the West, we fragment because we have sometimes a radical individualism where we see our totality of our identity, how we see and perceive ourselves. And this individualism in the West didn't come out of a vacuum. The Protestant Reformation 500 years ago fueled this concept of the individual. And of course, it's developed over hundreds of years and expressed itself in different ways. But the doctrine and the emphasis of the individual in opposition to the community, really seeped into the Western culture and psyche because of the Protestant Reformation. The German reformer Martin Luther, in his doctrine of the priesthood of all believers, gave center stage and priority to the individual believer and their relationship with God. Of course, that is true. But often he did that, or the way he constructed it and the way that it has been expressed throughout the centuries, is that individualism or that individual relationship with God takes precedence over the community. Of course, the Reformation came out of that universal community of the Catholic Church. They wanted a purer religion. But in the pursuit of a greater individualism, a greater relationship with just the believer and God, hence the priest of all believers, you get this priority of the individual over the community. And, philosophers have criticized that over the years. And in particular, Friedrich Nietzsche, a German philosopher, criticized this Reformation thought because he saw it as counterproductive. Because what you do is you split the church into discrete units of individuals. And those individuals, based on a divergent belief of their community, can then just go and split again and say, hey, I'm going to follow my conscience. I'm going to follow what I believe. And what you get is a fragmentation of the community. And that's why we have 45,000 different denominations. And in one sense, when you prioritize the individual, you sometimes lose the benefit of the community. And we were not created just to be individuals. Once again, if we fragment the body, if we fragment the community, we rupture and fragment it, we actually rupture and fragment ourselves. It's indistinguishable. God places us in relationship with one another, and we only understand our true selves in relationship with one another. And therefore, if we break and if we fragment, what we do, we don't just fragment finances, thinking about if we are a collective corporate church. We don't just fragment the talent amongst different groups. We don't just fragment the ministry amongst different groups. When we split, we actually fragment our own psyche. We actually lose a bit of our own identity and understanding of ourselves. We see ourselves more clearly when we are brought into relationship with other people and the community. It is through our relationship, when we see ourselves through others' eyes, we get a clearer picture of our role and our purpose to serve and to love. When we fragment the community, which the Church of God has ad infinitum, we don't just fragment resources, we fragment ourselves, our psyche, our sense of our own identity. The community does not become purer when you fragment because of doctrinal beliefs or processes or procedures of whatever reason you might split. You become less functional. You become less aware of who you are because God wanted you to be in community with His body, His people. We see ourselves through other people's eyes and we gain a better understanding of who we are. You might say, well, it's just me and God. That's where I'm at. It's just me and God. Well, God's with the community. That's where God's at. Yes, God is your God, and you have a direct relationship with Him. But to say it's just you and God and no one else is to miss the truth that God is with the community. As we start to wrap up, let's listen to the powerful and profound words of Jesus in His prayer. One of the prayers that the church down through the ages has failed to live up to, including you and I. John 17, verses 20 to 21. Jesus prays a prayer, and it shows here that God is with the community. God wants the relationship amongst His believers to be strong and unified. He says, I do not pray, Jesus, a priestly prayer. I do not pray for these alone, but also for those who will believe in me through their word. What's the purpose of them coming together, of them believing? That they all may be one, as you, Father, are in me, and I in you, that they also may be one in us. You know, just think about the unity between the Father and the Son. And God's saying, yeah, I want that for the body of believers. I want that for the church of God. I want that for those who have my Spirit. I want them to be one in us, that the world may believe that you sent me. The prayer that the church of God has probably never fully lived up to down through the history of God's church in his church age. God asks us to understand who we are when we see ourselves through his eyes. Yes, when you look at yourself through Jesus, yes, you see your proper orientation, your proper understanding of your place in the community. You understand who you are. You're a child of God. But God says, look, I want you to understand who you are, but I want you to be one with the community. I want you to understand your function and purpose and identity is only fully realized in relationship with other people. This is the mystery. This is God's purpose, God's plan. You see, the oneness of Adam and Eve. When he looked at her, he named her. And when naming her, he could see his own purpose, his own identity, and his own function and role in life. You see, that oneness, that togetherness, where they became a team, a package, was a type and a purpose of what God is doing with all of us and all creation. And that is that he's calling us into a marvelous oneness, a unity with him and with other believers. In fact, actually, we'll end. We started with bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. We'll end with bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, because the relationship of Adam and Eve is a type of what God is doing on this earth and what he's doing with the church. The marriage is a mystery, and this is what Jesus says through Paul when he inspires him. For we are members of his body, of his flesh and of his bones. That is the church, talking of the church. We're members of him. We are one with him. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one, just as Adam and Eve did. They understand their purpose, identity, and function through one another. And so must we. Why? Paul continues, verse 32. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. Christ and the church. You know, we see ourselves properly through the eyes of Christ, but we see ourselves properly through the eyes of each other when we're brought into relationship with one another, when we see one another. This morning, you and I have come together. You and I have come together, and in coming together, we have seen one another. And in seeing one another this morning, even albeit not physical, but on a live stream, in seeing one another, we understand a little bit more about ourselves, about our true identity, about our true function and our true purpose. I hope you enjoy the rest of the Sabbath. I hope you're able to connect with people, and in connecting with people, understanding a little bit more about who you are and what God has called you to be in his church. Until next week, have a great week. It has been great connecting with you, and take care.